Madison tossed my cracked leather purse into the trash bin right in the middle of the crowded restaurant, screaming that I was embarrassing them. My son just watched, choosing his image over the mother who starved to feed him. They thought I would walk away in shame. Instead, I turned to the man watching from the corner, a powerful lawyer who held the lease to their company headquarters. That night, I finally stopped being their doormat. My name is Lorraine Walker, and at 62 years old, I have learned that invisibility is a skill I have perfected out of necessity. I sat at the head of the table in a restaurant that smelled of truffles and expensive wine, situated somewhere on the affluent outskirts of typical Portland society. The crystal glasses caught the golden light from the chandeliers, fracturing it into rainbows that danced across the white tablecloth. Everyone around me looked like they had been cut from the pages of a glossy magazine. My son, Ethan, sat to my right, his suit crisp and new, laughing at a joke I did not understand. I smoothed the fabric of my navy blue dress. It was clean, and I had ironed it twice before leaving my apartment. But against the silk and velvet surrounding me, it looked exactly what it was. Old. Madison, my daughter-in-law, sat across from me. She was beautiful in that sharp, terrifying way that modern money buys. Her eyes, however, were not on her husband or the menu. They were fixed on the empty chair beside me where I had placed my handbag. It was a brown leather bag I had bought 10 years ago at a thrift store. The strap was fraying, and the leather near the clasp had spiderwebbed into a patch of cracks. To Madison, it was not just a bag. It was a stain on her perfect evening. A young waiter hurried past us, his hand slipping as he cleared a plate, causing a fork to clatter loudly onto the floor. The manager shot him a withering look, and I saw the boy's face flush crimson. My heart squeezed. I knew that look. I knew that fear. Without thinking, I reached for my bag, fumbling with the stiff clasp to pull out a $5 bill, intending to press it into his hand when he came back to offer him some small comfort. The clasp made a sharp click. Madison stood up so abruptly her chair screeched against the polished floor. The conversation died instantly. "Stop acting like that," she hissed, her voice cutting through the ambient jazz like a serrated knife. "You are embarrassing us in front of our friends." I froze, my hand half inside the purse. I looked at Ethan, waiting for him to defend me, to tell his wife that his mother was just trying to be kind. Ethan stared at his wine glass, swirling the red liquid round and round. "That thing looks like you dragged it out of a dumpster." Madison spat, her manicured hand shooting out to grab the strap of my bag. Before I could close my fingers around it, she yanked it away. "Madison, please," I whispered, the heat rising in my cheeks. She did not listen. She turned on her heel, marching toward the entrance with my purse dangling from her fingertips like a dead rat. Through the glass partition, I watched her walk out the front door, swing her arm back, and hurl my bag into the large metal trash bin standing near the valet stand. She dusted her hands off as she walked back in, a satisfied smirk plastered on her face. The silence at the table was deafening. Guests at other tables were staring. A woman in pearls whispered behind her hand. I looked at my son again. He finally looked up, his eyes pleading, but not for me. "Mum, do not make a scene," he said, his voice low and cold. "It is just a bag. We will buy you a new one. Please, just sit down. It is just a bag." Inside that bag was the only photograph I had left of his father, Jim, taken the day we bought our first house. Inside that bag was an envelope with $200 I had saved for months to give to them as a gift for the baby they were planning. I did not sit down. I pushed my chair back. My legs felt heavy, as if I were dragging the weight of every shift I had ever worked, every meal I had skipped so Ethan could have new shoes, every moment of pride I had swallowed. I walked past my son. I walked past Madison, who rolled her eyes and took a sip of her sparkling water. I walked out of the warmth and into the biting evening air. The valet boy looked away as I approached the trash bin. The smell of stale smoke and wet cardboard hit me. I could see the strap of my bag sticking out from under a greasy pizza box. Shame burned in my chest, hot and suffocating. I was 62 years old, dressed in my best clothes, digging through garbage outside a restaurant where my son was celebrating his promotion. I reached in, my fingers brushing against something sticky, trying to dislodge the bag. "You do not need to do that," a voice said from behind me. It was a deep voice, aged like oak, steady and firm. I froze, my hand still gripping the strap of my purse. I pulled it free and clutched it against my chest, wiping a smear of sauce off the leather with my sleeve before turning around. Standing under the glow of the street lamp was a man in a charcoal overcoat. His hair was entirely silver, swept back from a face that time had lined but not softened. His eyes were the same piercing grey I remembered from a lifetime ago. "Thomas," I breathed. Thomas Hale. The boy who had promised to take me to Paris when we were 18. The man who had disappeared to law school and never came back. He was looking at me, not with pity, but with a simmering anger that was directed entirely over my shoulder, toward the restaurant window. "They are the ones who should be ashamed." "Lorraine," he said, stepping closer. "Not you. Never you." He extended a hand. It was not the hand of the boy I knew, but the hand of a man who commanded rooms and signed contracts that shifted millions of dollars. I looked at my own hand, stained with the grime of the trash bin, shaking uncontrollably. I hesitated. He did not pull back. He waited until I placed my trembling fingers in his palm. His grip was warm and solid, an anchor in the storm that was tearing my dignity apart. Thomas looked past me, through the glass window where Madison was laughing, throwing her head back as if she had not just discarded a human being along with an old accessory. His jaw tightened. "Come on," he said softly. "Let us get you out of here." I held my dirty bag tighter, feeling the outline of Jim's photo through the leather. And for the first time that night, I did not look down. The silence in my apartment was heavy, a stark contrast to the clinking glass and jazz music of the restaurant. I sat at my small, laminate kitchen table, the one I had bought second-hand 15 years ago, and placed my purse in the center. It looked pathetic under the harsh fluorescent ceiling light. The leather was scuffed where it had hit the bottom of the trash bin, and there was a faint, sticky residue of something that smelled like stale beer near the zipper. I unzipped it slowly, my hands still trembling slightly. Inside, the white envelope was safe. $200. It was not a lot of money to people like Madison, probably not even the cost of the wine they had ordered tonight. But to me, it was 3 months of skipping lunch at the senior center. I pulled out the photograph tucked behind the bills. Jim looked back at me, his smile crooked, his eyes full of a simple, quiet love. He had been gone for 12 years now. A stroke took him in the middle of the night, leaving me with a mortgage, a teenage son, and a job at the Red Willow Community Learning Center that barely paid above minimum wage. I traced the edge of the photo. I remembered the years after he died. I remembered walking to work in the snow because the car needed tires and Ethan needed a prom suit. I remembered eating toast for dinner so there would be enough meat for Ethan's plate. I had spent 30 years making myself smaller, quieter, and cheaper, just so my son could grow up to be big, loud, and successful. I closed my eyes and saw a different Ethan. He was 7 years old, his knees grass-stained, holding out a fistful of wilting dandelions. He had looked at me with such fierce devotion and said, "Mum, when I grow up, I am going to buy you a whole garden of real flowers. I am going to buy you the moon." Where had that boy gone? When did he become the man who sat silently while his wife treated me like something she had stepped in? I stood up and walked to the dresser in the hallway. The bottom drawer stuck, like it always did, requiring a sharp tug to open. Underneath a stack of winter linens lay a cigar box. I opened it. Inside were letters I had written 40 years ago, but never mailed. They were addressed to Thomas Hale. He had asked me to go with him to New York. He had big dreams, wild ambition. But my mother had gripped my arm and told me to stop being foolish. Jim was safe. Jim was steady. Thomas was a gamble. So I stayed. I chose safety. And tonight, safety had felt like a prison. Madison's voice echoed in my ears, shrill and hateful. "Stop acting like that." Acting like what? Like a human being. Like his mother. I walked back to the kitchen and picked up the bank statement I had left on the counter. I smoothed out the wrinkles. I looked at the withdrawals from 2 months ago. $500 transferred to Ethan for car repairs. $300 to pay off a credit card bill he said was an emergency. They lived in a house with marble countertops. Yet they came to me, the woman with the trash bin purse, when they were short on cash. I was their safety net. But they treated me like a spiderweb they wanted to brush away. My phone buzzed on the table. I stared at the screen. A text from Ethan. "Mom, do not be mad. Things are crazy tonight. I will call you tomorrow. Love you." It was the same message he had sent a dozen times before. It was a script. He thought a few words on a screen could erase the image of his wife throwing my dignity into the garbage. He thought I would do what I always did. I would swallow the hurt. I would say it was okay. I would prioritize his peace over my own self-worth. But as I looked at that phone, I realized something terrifying. I had taught him this. I had taught him that my love was unconditional, even when it was abused. I had taught him that he could hurt me without consequence. The phone rang then, startling me. It was not Ethan. The name on the screen made my breath hitch. Thomas. I swiped to answer, pressing the phone to my ear. "Lorraine." His voice came through, deep and steady, grounding me just like it had outside the restaurant. "I am parked downstairs. I did not want to leave you alone tonight. Come down. Let us have a coffee." He did not tell me to calm down. He did not tell me it was just a misunderstanding. He just offered to be there. I lowered the phone. I walked to the bathroom and turned on the light. The woman in the mirror looked tired. Her grey hair was coming loose from its bun. Her eyes were red-rimmed. But I looked closer. I saw the line of her jaw, set hard. I reached into my makeup bag and pulled out a tube of lipstick I had not worn since Jim's funeral. It was a deep, defiant red. I applied it carefully, watching my lips transform. I smoothed my hair. I straightened the collar of my navy dress. I was 62 years old. I had been humiliated. I had been discarded. But as I looked at my reflection, I saw a spark in my eyes that I thought had died decades ago. It was the spark of the girl who had almost run away to New York. I grabbed my purse, the one Madison despised, and walked out the door. I was done being the mother who waited by the phone. Tonight, I was Lorraine. The cafe Thomas had chosen was a small, quiet place near the riverbank, far removed from the crystal chandeliers and judgmental eyes of the restaurant we had left behind. We sat in a corner booth, the smell of roasted beans and rain hanging in the air. Thomas stirred his black coffee slowly, the silver spoon chiming softly against the ceramic. He told me about the last 40 years in a voice that was devoid of boasting, just stating facts. He spoke of the nights he spent studying while working as a janitor, the cases he took when no one else would, and how he eventually became a senior partner at Kingsley Meridian Group, a name even I recognized from the skyline of the city. I listened, but my mind was still replaying the sound of my purse hitting the bottom of that trash bin. When he finished, I poured it all out. I told him every word Madison had said, how her voice had sliced through the air, and how Ethan had looked at his wine glass instead of his mother. I told him about the waiter's pity and the valet's averted eyes. Thomas did not interrupt. When I finished, he did not offer platitudes. Instead, he reached across the table and placed his hand gently on my battered leather purse, covering the cracks with his palm as if protecting evidence at a crime scene. "Has it always been like this?" he asked quietly. "Or was tonight an exception?" I opened my mouth to defend them, to say it was just the stress of the promotion, but the words died in my throat. Memories I had suppressed began to surface. I remembered last Thanksgiving, when Madison had set my place setting at the children's table because the main table was for important guests. I remembered the time she told me not to wear my favorite floral dress to her baby shower because it clashed with her color scheme. I remembered how Ethan would cut me off whenever I started telling stories about how I worked 2 jobs to pay for his braces. It was not an exception. It was a system. They had been training me to be invisible for years. Thomas watched the realization dawn on my face. His expression hardened. He leaned in slightly, his tone shifting from friend to lawyer. "Lorraine, who holds the title to your apartment?" I blinked, surprised by the sudden turn. "It is mine. Jim and I paid it off years ago." "And have you signed anything recently? Any documents Ethan or Madison gave you?" I hesitated. "Well, Ethan brought over some papers a few months ago. He said something about tax benefits for his new position, and that he needed a guarantor for a business loan to help with his credit score. He said it was just a formality because I had a clean history. I signed them. I trust him. He is my son." Thomas went very still. He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes calculating. "Your son works for a subsidiary of Brightshaw Urban Development, does he not?" "Yes," I said. "That is the company he was just promoted in." Thomas set his cup down. A humorless smile touched his lips. "Life has a strange sense of humor. Lorraine, Kingsley Meridian Group, my firm, owns the building that Brightshaw uses as their headquarters. We are currently in the middle of a very aggressive lease renegotiation. If your son's company is as leveraged as I suspect they are, and if he has dragged you into his financial mess without explaining the risks, we have a problem." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "I want you to come to my office tomorrow. I want to see every piece of paper you have signed. Madison's family plays games with money. Lorraine, if they needed your signature, it is because they did not want to use their own assets. They might be using your name to shield themselves from liability. My stomach dropped. A cold wave of nausea washed over me. I cannot do that. Thomas, I said, my voice shaking. If I start digging into legal matters, Ethan could lose his job. Madison will leave him. I do not want to be the reason their marriage falls apart. I just want peace. Thomas looked at me with an intensity that made me want to look away. They are using your fear to control you. Lorraine, they know you will stay silent to keep the peace, so they feel comfortable throwing your dignity into the garbage. The law exists to protect people like you, but only if you dare to step forward. He saw me wavering, saw the terror in my eyes at the thought of fighting my own child. He softened his tone. You do not have to do it alone. I have a junior associate, Elena Moore. She is brilliant and kind. She can review your documents just to make sure you are safe. No one has to know yet. Just let us look. I looked down at my hands. They were the hands that had scrubbed floors and changed diapers and counted pennies. They were the hands that Madison had swatted away like annoying insects. I thought about Ethan's silence. I thought about the $200 in the envelope that they probably would have laughed at. Okay, I said, the word coming out as a whisper. I will come. Thomas nodded, signaling for the check. But Thomas, I added, raising my head to look him in the eye. I do not want to ruin my son's life. I do not want to destroy him. I paused, my fingers tightening around the strap of my purse. I just want them to understand that no one has the right to throw another human being into a trash bin like they did to this bag. I want them to know I am not garbage. The office of Elena Moore was quiet, smelling faintly of lemon polish and old paper. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic noise inside my head. Elena was young, perhaps the same age as Madison, but where my daughter-in-law was all sharp edges and performative cruelty, Elena was focused and gentle. She sat across from me, a stack of files between us, her finger tracing a line of text on a document that Thomas had requested from the bank earlier that morning. Mrs. Walker, she said, her voice low. I need you to look at this. Do you recognize this loan agreement? I squinted at the paper. The numbers swam before my eyes. It was a secured line of credit for $300,000, attached to a company called Lane Ventures, which I knew belonged to Madison's family. But right there, listed as the primary guarantor, was my name. And listed as collateral was the address of my apartment. My breath hitched. Ethan had brought papers to me 6 months ago. He had stood in my kitchen, eating the apple pie I had made, and told me he needed a co-signer for a small personal loan to boost his credit score so he could get better rates for a future mortgage. He had smiled that boyish smile and said it was just a formality because the bank loved my perfect payment history. He did not tell me I was betting my home on his wife's family business. If they default on this, Elena said, watching my face carefully, the bank has the right to foreclose on your apartment to recover the debt. I felt the room spin. My apartment was not a mansion like Madison's, but it was mine. It was paid for. It was the only place in the world where I was safe. Ethan knew that. He knew how hard his father and I had worked to pay off that mortgage, and he had risked it without even blinking. There is more, Elena continued. She pulled out another sheet, A digital copy of an addendum sent via email. It authorized an increase in the credit limit. At the bottom was my signature. I stared at the ink. It looked like my name. It looped the way I looped my L's. But something was wrong. Look at the date, Elena pointed out. January 14th. I shook my head. That is impossible. I was in the hospital that week with pneumonia. I could barely lift a spoon, let alone sign legal documents. Elena nodded grimly. This was sent from Madison's email address. It looks like a high-quality scan of your signature from a previous document, pasted onto this one. In legal terms, Mrs. Walker, this is forgery, and it is fraud. I slumped back in the chair. They had not just thrown my purse away. They had been stealing my security, piece by piece, behind my back. The image of Madison screaming at me in the restaurant suddenly took on a sinister new light. She was not just embarrassed by me, she was using me. Thomas, who had been standing by the window looking out at the city skyline, turned around. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were cold. Eleanor, who is the leasing agent listed for Lane Ventures' new headquarters? He asked. Eleanor flipped through the file. It says they are finalizing a lease at the Skyline Plaza. Thomas let out a short, dry laugh. He walked over to the table and placed his hand on the stack of papers. The Skyline Plaza, he said, looking at me. My firm, Kingsley Meridian, is closing the deal to acquire that building next week. We are inheriting all current lease negotiations, which means Lorraine, the company that Madison's family depends on. The company that is using your home as a poker chip needs my signature to keep their office. The room went silent. I looked from Thomas to Elena. I did not understand the complexities of corporate real estate, but I understood the look on Thomas's face. It was the look of a man who had just been handed a loaded weapon. Elena leaned forward, her tone shifting from investigative to strategic. Here is what we can do, Mrs. Walker. First, we protect you. We send a formal legal notice to the bank and to Lane Ventures revoking all authorizations immediately due to suspected fraud. That freezes their access to your assets. But Thomas has a bigger idea. We can use this, Thomas said. We can use the lease negotiation. If they want that office space, they have to go through us, and we can make the lease conditional. He looked at me, his expression softening. I can make this go away quietly. Lorraine, we can sever the ties, save your apartment, and you never have to speak to them again. Or we can make them take responsibility. We can force them to look at what they did. He paused. Do you want to just escape? Or do you want them to answer for this? I thought about the trash bin. I thought about the fake signature. I thought about Ethan lying to my face while eating my pie. If I just walked away, they would find someone else to use. They would never learn. They would never see me. I want them to look, I said, my voice trembling but clear. I want them to be forced to look at what they did. Elena nodded and pulled a fresh document toward me. It was a representation agreement, giving her and Thomas the power to act on my behalf. Then we are going to draft an ethical addendum to their lease, Thomas said. If they want a place to do business, they are going to have to prove they know how to treat human beings. Starting with you? I picked up the pen. My hand shook, just like it had in the restaurant. But this time it was not from fear. It was from the sheer, terrifying weight of finally standing up. I had signed so many things for Ethan out of blind trust. This time, I pressed the pen to the paper and wrote my name, Lorraine Walker. I put the pen down. If I had signed those other papers out of fear and love, this time, I signed for myself. 2 days later, Ethan and Madison invited me to their new house in the hills. They called it a family dinner to clear the air. But as I walked through the double mahogany doors, the air felt thin and cold, like the inside of a bank vault. The house was magnificent, all white marble and glass, smelling of expensive lilies and ambition. I was not surprised to find I was not the only guest. Sitting on the cream-coloured velvet sofa was Veronica Lane, Madison's mother. She was a woman who wore her power like a heavy coat. She held a crystal tumbler of sparkling water, her eyes scanning me from my sensible shoes to the collar of my polyester blouse. She smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. It was the kind of smile a shark gives before it decides if you are worth eating. We did not even make it to the dining table. Madison guided us into the living room, where a thick stack of documents sat on the coffee table, looking innocent enough next to a vase of orchids. "We just want to make sure you are taken care of, Mom," Madison said, her voice sugary sweet. She sat close to me. Too close. "We have been talking with our financial team, and they found a way to optimize some tax liabilities. It will actually protect your assets in the long run. We just need a few signatures to set up the trust." She slid the papers toward me. I put on my reading glasses, ignoring the slight sigh of impatience from Veronica. I scanned the dense paragraphs. Elena had drilled me for 3 hours yesterday on what to look for. I saw the words irrevocable power of attorney. I saw transfer of deed. I saw absolute indemnification. These were not papers to protect me. These were papers to strip me of the little I had left and hand full control to Lane Ventures. I lowered the papers. "I think I would like to take these home to read over properly," I said softly. "The legal language is a bit dense for me to understand right now." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Madison's smile vanished. She exchanged a quick, sharp look with Ethan. "Mom, honestly," Madison snapped, dropping the act. "Stop acting like that. You always have to make everything so difficult. We are trying to help you. You are being paranoid." The phrase hit me like a physical blow. Stop acting like that. It was the same thing she had screamed when she threw my purse away. It was her code for stop having an opinion, stop having boundaries, stop being a person. Veronica leaned forward, the ice in her glass clinking. "Mrs. Walker, let us be realistic," she said, her voice smooth and condescending. "At your station in life, the opportunity to have your affairs managed by a firm like ours is a privilege. Most people with your background would be grateful just to be allowed inside a house like this, let alone be part of its financial structure. You should thank your lucky stars my daughter is willing to look after you." I looked at Ethan. He was staring at his shoes, studying the shine on the leather. He knew what they were doing. He knew they were insulting me. And he said nothing. A calmness settled over me, cold and hard. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen 3 times and placed it face up on the coffee table between the vase of orchids and the predatory contract. The red timer began to count up. "If we are discussing such wonderful things for my future," I said, smiling pleasantly at Veronica, "then surely you do not mind if I record this conversation for my records? I would hate to forget any of your generous advice." Silence slammed into the room. Madison froze. Veronica's mouth tightened into a thin line. For people who lived their lives manipulating the truth, a recording device was a loaded gun. Madison let out a nervous laugh that sounded more like a cough. "Mom, that is ridiculous. Put that away. We are family." "If we are family, then you have nothing to hide," I replied, leaving the phone right where it was. Ethan finally spoke, his voice cracking. "Mom, please. You are making everyone uncomfortable. And you are making me broke." "Ethan," I thought, but I kept my face smooth. Madison shifted gears instantly. Her face softened into a mask of concern. "Mum, look, we are just worried about your memory. As you get older, managing finances gets hard. We just want to make sure no one takes advantage of you." The irony was so thick I could taste it. I stood up, smoothing down my skirt. I picked up the stack of documents. "I appreciate your concern," I said, my voice steady. "But I will not be signing anything tonight. I will let my lawyer review these first." Madison scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your lawyer? Since when do you have a lawyer? What? Did you find someone at the strip mall next to the laundromat?" Veronica smirked, taking a sip of her water. I picked up my phone and stopped the recording. I looked Madison dead in the eye. "Yes, my lawyer. And he is very interested in how Lane Ventures conducts its business." I picked up my purse, the one she had thrown in the trash, the one Thomas had helped me repair. I gripped the handle tight. "And Madison," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "If I ever let anyone treat me like garbage again, it will not be you. That was the last time." I walked to the door. No one moved to stop me. They were too stunned that the furniture had started talking back. I stepped out into the cool evening air, the heavy door clicking shut behind me. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of violet and blood orange. I looked at the purse in my hand. It was old. It was scarred. But it was mine. And for the first time in years, I felt like the woman holding it was formidable. The war had started, and they had no idea what was coming for them. Monday morning. 2 heavy courier envelopes left the offices of Kingsley Meridian Group. They were delivered by hand, requiring signatures that would mark the exact minute the ground began to shift beneath my son's feet. The first envelope went to the bank, formally revoking all powers of attorney attached to my name and flagging the $300,000 credit line for immediate fraud review. The second went to the legal department of Brightshaw Urban Development, notifying them that their lease negotiations were now under audit due to concerns regarding the financial transparency of their primary contractor, Lane Ventures. The reaction was instantaneous. Thomas told me later that the boardroom at Brightshaw turned into a hornet's nest. They had discovered that the company building their projects was leveraging the homes of elderly relatives to stay afloat. It was a risk liability no compliance officer could ignore. My phone began to ring just after lunch. I stared at Madison's name on the screen. My stomach twisted into a knot, the old reflex of fear trying to seize my throat. But I forced myself to answer. "You are ruining everything," Madison screamed before I could even say hello. Her voice was not the polished, condescending tone I was used to. It was raw, panicked, and ugly. "Do you have any idea what you have done? The bank just froze our operating accounts. They are threatening to pull the funding for the whole subdivision." I held the phone away from my ear, her volume distorting the speaker. "If the company goes under, Ethan goes down with it," she spat, playing the one card she knew would hurt me. He will lose his job. He will be blacklisted. Is that what you want? Do you want to see your son on the street because you are too selfish to just sign a piece of paper? My hand shook, but I did not apologize. I did not offer to fix it. I pressed the red button and ended the call. 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, it was Ethan. I answered, bracing myself. Mom. His voice sounded thin, stretched to the breaking point. I could hear Madison in the background. Her voice a high-pitched shriek of rage, throwing things. Mom? Why? Ethan asked, and he sounded like a confused child. Why did you bring lawyers into this? We could have worked this out. You are blowing up my entire life. I closed my eyes, leaning my forehead against the cool glass of my kitchen window. I did not blow up your life, Ethan, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. You did. You forged my signature on a loan that put the roof over my head at risk. You gambled my safety to buy your wife's family more time. He started to stammer, to offer the same excuses about how it was just a formality, how he was going to handle it. Ethan, stop. I cut him off. I have one question. If I had not found out, if Thomas had not looked at those papers, would you have ever told me, or would you have let me lose my apartment one day without ever knowing why? The silence on the other end was absolute. It lasted 5 seconds, 10 seconds. In that silence, the heart of a mother broke, not with a bang, but with a quiet, terrible fracture. He did not have an answer because we both knew the truth. While I dealt with the heartbreak, Thomas was dealing with the shark. Veronica Lane had requested a private meeting with him. She arrived at a neutral location, a high-end steakhouse, wearing a suit that cost more than my car. She tried to speak to him in what she called business language. She suggested that perhaps there were consulting fees or advisory roles available for a man of his experience if he could smooth over these misunderstandings. She offered him status. She offered him connections. She did not know that Thomas was not just listening, he was taking notes. Every veiled bribe, every suggestion that they could make this go away for a price, was being documented. He told me later that he simply drank his iced tea and let her dig her own grave. Back at the office, Elena was pitching a new angle to the board of Kingsley Meridian. She argued that this was not just a lease dispute, it was a branding opportunity. She proposed that Kingsley could position itself as a champion of ethical business, enforcing a code of conduct that protected the vulnerable from predatory financial practices. Suddenly, I was no longer just an old woman who had been insulted at dinner. I was becoming a symbol. The realization made me feel small and terrified, but also strangely heavy, like an anchor that had finally found the seabed. That night, I sat in my armchair by the window, looking out at the city lights. The silence in my apartment felt different. It was not the lonely silence of a widow anymore. It was the tense silence before a storm. I thought about Ethan's voice. I thought about the fear of him losing his career. Was I the villain? Was I the bad mother, destroying her child's future to soothe her own ego? Then I looked at the empty chair where my purse sat. I remembered the feeling of the cold air on my face as I walked out of that restaurant. I remembered the sound of the heavy trash bin lid. No. I stood up and walked over to the mantelpiece where Jim's photo stood. He looked so young, so full of hope. I am not taking revenge, Jim, I whispered to the frame. I am not trying to hurt him. I am just stopping them. I am just making sure that no one ever wipes their feet on us again. I touched the glass. And if he has to fall to learn how to stand up like a man, then I have to let him fall. The rumours started as a slow trickle before bursting into a flood that drowned the reputation of Lane Ventures. In the tight-knit world of real estate development, uncertainty is a death sentence. And the news that Kingsley Meridian was freezing their massive lease negotiation caused panic in the market. Suddenly, the company that Madison's family ran was not seen as a golden goose, but as a toxic asset. Veronica Lane, a woman who had spent 40 years bullying bankers and zoning boards, found herself on the other side of the table. For the first time, her calls were not being returned. Lenders who had previously wined and dined her were now sending cold emails demanding additional collateral for existing loans. She realized with terrifying clarity that the insignificant elderly woman she had mocked in her living room had managed to summon a legal storm that threatened to wash away her entire empire. Ethan was caught directly in the center of the hurricane. At his office, the partners were frantic, looking for someone to blame for the stalled negotiations. At home, Madison and Veronica turned on him with vicious intensity. They did not blame themselves for the fraud or the cruelty. They blamed him for failing to control his mother. He was being crushed between the demands of his job and the venom of his wife's family. And for the first time, he began to see that he was just as disposable to them as I was. One rainy Tuesday evening, there was a quiet knock on my door. When I opened it, I barely recognized my own son. Ethan looked 10 years older, his eyes hollow and dark circles bruising the skin beneath them. He walked in and sat on the edge of my sofa, wringing his hands. He told me about a meeting that had happened earlier that day at the Lane estate. With the pressure mounting, Veronica had proposed a solution that made my blood run cold. She had suggested shifting a massive amount of their bad debt into a new shell company, one that they would manipulate me into signing for by using the old power of attorney documents, hoping the bank would not catch up until it was too late. Ethan told me that when he hesitated, Madison had snapped at him. She had said that I was old, that I had lived my life, and that sacrificing my credit to save their legacy was the least I could do. I sat there, listening to my son describe how his wife had planned to bury me under a mountain of debt just to save her own social standing. Ethan looked up at me, his face wet with tears. I stood up and walked out. "Mum," he whispered. I told them I would not do it. I looked at him, feeling a mixture of relief and profound sadness. I reached out and touched his shoulder. "Ethan," I asked softly, "if Madison had not thrown my purse away that night, if I had not gotten angry and found Thomas, would you have gone along with it? Would you have told me?" Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked down at the floor, his shoulders shaking as he began to sob. He did not answer. He did not have to. We both knew that without that moment of public humiliation to wake him up, he would have let them consume me piece by piece. While my family was fracturing, Thomas and Elena were tightening the screws. They finalized the new lease addendum for the headquarters. It was brutal. They raised the rent by 15% and shortened the lease term to 5 years. But the centerpiece of the document was Section 14, the Ethical Standards Clause. It explicitly stated that any contractor associated with the tenant must adhere to strict guidelines regarding the financial treatment of vulnerable dependents. It also included a non-negotiable requirement for a formal, public rectification of past grievances against me. Kingsley Meridian sent the ultimatum to Brightshore Urban Development, sign the new lease with the addendum and force Lane Ventures to comply. Or Kingsley would terminate the deal and lease the building to a competitor. Brightshaw, desperate to secure the location. Turned on Veronica Lane and told her to do whatever was necessary to make the problem go away. Veronica tried to fight. She called Thomas, offering to pay a settlement, offering to make a private donation to a charity of my choice, anything to avoid the public shame. Thomas told me later that his response was short and cold. He told her that we do not negotiate on the minimum price of respect. 2 days later, I received an email from Elena. I opened it on my phone while standing in my kitchen. They have agreed to the terms, the email read. However, we insisted that the apology cannot be a private letter. It must be done at the upcoming community signing event, in front of the press and their investors. They have accepted. Are you ready for this? I lowered the phone. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Public. They wanted me to stand on a stage in front of cameras and strangers. Every instinct I had nurtured over 60 years told me to hide, to stay small, to be safe. Then I looked at the empty space by the door where my purse hung. I thought about Madison's plan to use me as a debt mule. I thought about Ethan's silence. I typed my reply with steady fingers. I will come. Elena sat across from me in my small living room, laying out the schedule for the day like a general preparing for battle. She explained that this was not going to be a quiet meeting in a back room. It was a community sponsorship signing event between Brightshaw and Kingsley, held at the City Convention Centre. There would be reporters, photographers, industry leaders, and a specific segment of the program dedicated to a statement of rectification, where my name would be spoken aloud. I listened to her, nodding mechanically, but inside, my stomach was churning. That evening, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror. My mother had always taught me that a good woman was like the foundation of a house, essential, sturdy, but invisible. She taught me that drawing attention to oneself was a sign of vanity or trouble. Now, at 62 years old, I was preparing to walk deliberately into the center of a spotlight. I looked at my reflection, at the lines around my mouth and the grey in my hair, and the old fear rose up in my throat. I wanted to call Eleanor and cancel. I wanted to hide under my quilt. But then I remembered the sound of the trash bin lid slamming shut. The next afternoon, Thomas arrived at my door holding a white box. Inside was a brand new leather handbag. It was elegant, understated, and clearly expensive. I thought you might want something fresh for today, he said gently. A fresh start. I ran my hand over the smooth leather, touched by his kindness, but I shook my head. I went to the coat hook by the door and took down my old purse. The strap had a visible line where I had stitched it back together with heavy thread. The leather still bore the faint scuff marks from the dumpster. Thank you, Thomas, I said. But I am taking this one. It has a scar now. I want them to see it. I want them to remember that what they threw away, I valued enough to save. Thomas looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. He understood. This bag was my flag. Before we left, I checked my email. There was a message from Ethan. It was long, rambling, and lacked his usual corporate polish. He wrote that he would be at the event. He said he was not coming to take sides, but because he needed to look me in the face and see the end of what he had allowed to happen. I read it twice, but I did not reply. I felt a shift inside me, a hardening of the soft places where I used to make excuses for him. Then my phone buzzed with a text from Madison. It was short. I think you are pushing this way too far. No apology, no remorse. Just a complaint that I was being inconvenient. For the first time in 10 years, I did not type out a soothing response. I swiped the notification away and turned off my phone. That night, I dreamed of the restaurant again. The scene played out exactly as it had the laughter, the disdain. Madison walking toward the door with my bag. But in the dream, when she threw it, I did not run outside to retrieve it. I stood up, walked over to her, and simply looked her in the eye until she stopped laughing. I woke up with sweat cooling on my forehead, but the heavy stone that had been sitting on my chest for weeks was gone. I dressed carefully. I chose a simple black dress that Jim used to love. He always said I looked like a woman who knew her own mind when I wore it. I pinned a small silver brooch to the collar. It was the only thing my mother had left me, a woman who had lived and died doing what she was told. I wore it as a reminder that I was breaking the cycle she had been trapped in. In the car, on the way to the venue, Thomas broke the silence. "Lorraine," he asked, looking at the road ahead. "If they apologize today, truly apologize, what do you want after that?" I watched the city pass by the window. I thought about forgiveness. I thought about family dinners. "I do not need them to love me, Thomas," I said quietly. "I just need them to stop thinking that humiliating people is a normal part of doing business. I want them to be afraid to ever do it again." When we arrived, the hall was blindingly bright. Logos for Brightshaw and Kingsley were plastered on backdrops. The air buzzed with the low hum of conversation. I saw Veronica and Madison standing in a corner near the stage. They were arguing in hushed, angry whispers over a piece of paper, presumably the statement they were forced to read. They looked small under the harsh lights, stripped of the armor of their private drawing rooms. Thomas led me to the side of the stage, behind the heavy velvet curtains. The master of ceremonies walked to the podium, his voice booming through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we proceed with the signing, we have a moment of significant importance regarding corporate responsibility and the respect we owe to the generation that built this community." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. My hands shook, but I gripped the handle of my scarred purse, took a breath that went all the way to the bottom of my lungs, and took the first step forward. The president of Brightshaw Urban Development stood at the podium, a man with a smile that showed too many teeth and reached nowhere near his eyes. He spoke about a new era of corporate responsibility and ethical alignment, using buzzwords that floated over the audience like empty balloons. When he finished, he gestured for Veronica Lane to approach the microphone. Veronica walked across the stage with the stiff posture of a queen being forced to abdicate. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her blazer pocket and began to read. Her voice was smooth, detached, and utterly devoid of feeling. She spoke of procedural errors in document handling and regrettable miscommunications regarding family asset management. She made the attempted theft of my home sound like a filing mistake. I felt a flash of anger, but before it could settle, I saw Elena make a subtle hand signal from the wings. The master of ceremonies stepped forward, interrupting Veronica's polished retreat. "Thank you, Mrs. Lane," he said, his voice booming. "However, in the spirit of full transparency, we would like to invite the individual directly involved in the inciting incident to share a few words. Mrs. Madison Langford Walker, please come to the stage." Veronica froze. This was not the script she had agreed to. She looked furious, but with the cameras rolling, she had no choice but to step aside. Madison rose from her seat in the front row. She looked terrified. She walked up the stairs, her heels clicking a nervous rhythm. She took the paper Eleanor had prepared for her hands shaking so badly the page rattled against the microphone stand. Madison cleared her throat. She read the opening lines quickly, trying to get through the legal jargon. But then she reached the paragraph that detailed the events at the restaurant. She stopped. She looked out at the sea of faces, then down at the words. "I threw my mother-in-law's purse into a garbage bin," she read, her voice cracking. The sentence hung in the air, ugly and raw. She took a breath and continued. "I did so because I told her that her appearance and her poverty made our family look shameful." A gasp rippled through the room. It was one thing to hear about a dispute. It was another to hear a wealthy young woman admit to shaming an elder for being poor. I looked down at the front row. Ethan was sitting on the edge of his seat, his knuckles white as he gripped his own knees. His face was a mask of horror. For the first time, he was hearing the brutality of his wife's actions without the filter of her excuses. He was looking at the monster he had helped create. "Mrs. Walker," the master of ceremonies said, gesturing to me. I walked out from behind the curtain. I moved slowly, not because I was frail, but because I wanted them to see me. I wore my black dress. I carried my scarred purse in both hands, holding it like a shield. The cameras flashed, blinding white bursts of light, but I kept my eyes fixed on Madison. I stood next to her. I did not look at the audience. I looked right into her weeping eyes. "Stop acting like that," I thought, echoing her own words back to her in my mind. Madison looked at me, and something in her crumbled. She lowered the paper. She leaned toward the microphone, going completely off script. "I saw you as a problem to be fixed," she whispered. Her voice amplified across the silent hall. "I did not treat you like family. I treated you like an obstacle to the image I wanted to project." The room was dead silent. This was not a press release. This was a confession. The microphone was passed to me. I looked out at the hundreds of strangers, at the business titans and the reporters. I had the power to destroy her right then. I could have screamed. I could have demanded she beg. But I felt the weight of my purse in my hand, the weight of my own history. "I do not want you to kneel," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I do not want anyone here to kneel. I just want the young people in this room to remember one thing. You do not become elegant by throwing someone else into the trash. You do not rise higher by pushing someone else down. True class is how you treat people who can do nothing for you." I paused, then turned my gaze away from the crowd and looked directly down at the front row, locking eyes with my son. "Ethan?" I asked, my voice ringing out through the speakers. "The next time someone insults the people you claim to love, will you sit there in silence like you did that night?" The question hung in the air, a challenge that stripped away his corporate armor. Ethan stood up. He did not look at his boss. He did not look at the cameras. He looked at me. "No, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion, loud enough to be heard without a microphone. "I will not. I was wrong." For a second, there was no sound. Then, someone in the back started to clap. It was a slow, rhythmic applause. Then another person joined in, and another. It was not the polite, scattered applause of a business conference. It was the heavy, thunderous sound of people acknowledging a hard truth. I turned and walked off the stage. Thomas was waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs. He offered me his arm. You just did something that most men spend their whole lives afraid to do, he whispered as we walked away. You told the truth without using a knife. I glanced back one last time. Veronica Lane was standing alone on the stage, looking out at the crowd that was cheering for the woman she had tried to erase. For the first time in her life, she looked small. The lights were still on her, but the power had shifted, and we both knew it would never go back to the way it was. The morning after the event, the newspapers did not focus on the lease agreement or the square footage of the new headquarters. Instead, the headlines told the story of the mother whose purse was thrown in the trash and who forced a corporate empire to rewrite its moral code. I had become an accidental symbol of dignity, a reminder that respect is not a commodity that can be bought or sold. Lane Ventures had to follow through on every single promise. Elena Moore made sure of it. She oversaw the establishment of a new fund for elderly support and the groundbreaking of the Jim and Lorraine Walker Learning Corner at the community centre. The apology on their website was not hidden in a footer. It was front and centre, just as we had demanded. A few days later, a thick envelope arrived from the bank. Inside was a letter confirming that my name had been removed from every high-risk loan and credit line associated with the Lane family. My apartment was safe. The legal knot that had threatened to strangle my future was finally untied. I sat at my kitchen table and breathed easier than I had in 20 years. Ethan came to see me on a rainy Tuesday. He did not bring Madison, and he did not bring expensive gifts to buy my forgiveness. He brought a box of the almond cookies I used to bake for him when he was a boy, and a folder of papers. He sat across from me and showed me his resignation letter from Lane Ventures. He had mapped out a plan to find a job based on his own degree and his own hard work, away from the toxic shadow of his wife's family. I told him that I was proud of him, but I also drew a line in the sand. I told him that while I would always be his mother, I would no longer be his victim. I told him that I would not ban him from seeing Madison, as that was his marriage to navigate, but he had to take full responsibility for the way I was treated in his presence. He nodded, understanding that things had changed forever. Then came the email from Madison. It was not the angry, defensive text I expected. It was long and rambling. She did not ask for forgiveness, which I respected. Instead, she wrote about growing up in a house where affection was only given when she looked perfect, where her mother taught her that appearances were the only currency that mattered. For the first time, I did not see a monster. I saw a lonely, damaged girl who had been raised to bite before she could be bitten. I did not reply immediately. I printed the email and folded it carefully. I decided that one day, when we were both ready, we might sit down and talk. I left the door slightly ajar, not wide open, but not locked shut either. Life moved forward. Thomas invited me to join the advisory board for a new literacy project housed in the Kingsley building. I sat in a boardroom surrounded by young executives, and for the first time, I did not feel old or outdated. I felt experienced. I felt heard. One late afternoon, Thomas stopped by with 2 airline tickets to New England. He said he had to go for business before heading to Europe, but he wanted to show me the autumn leaves. I looked at the tickets, feeling the thrill of adventure I had suppressed for 40 years. I will go, I said, smiling at him. But on one condition. This time, I get to pick the hotel. Thomas laughed, the sound warm and genuine. He agreed immediately. I was no longer just a passenger in my own life. I was the navigator. That evening, I stood by my window, watching the city lights flicker on. My apartment was quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet, not a lonely one. I looked at the hook by the door where my old, scarred purse hung. It was no longer a symbol of my humiliation. It was a trophy. It was the proof of the day I decided to stand up. I whispered the words Madison had screamed at me. "Stop acting like that." I smiled. She was right. I would stop acting like that. I would stop acting small. I would stop acting afraid. I would stop acting like I did not matter. I turned off the lights, took my purse off the hook, and walked out the door into the cool night air, stepping into a future that finally belonged to me. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to hear where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let us share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, like the video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach even more people who might need to hear it.